Hey everyone! Yesterday we went ahead and made watercolors with ingredients that are in our kitchen. So today I want to build on that knowledge and teach different watercolor techniques. This is going to build again. Next video, we're going to take what we've learned and create a sunflower watercolor painting. So what I have today for our watercolor technique lesson, I have watercolors. Now remember, if you don't have watercolors at home, you can use coffee, tea, food coloring works the best, soy sauce, balsamic vinegar, and paprika, and cumin. Coriander is something that works really well that I just didn't have. So you can use what you have in your kitchen if you don't have your own watercolor palette at home, and it does the same thing. So I have my watercolor palette. I have plastic wrap. I have my cup of water, and I have a brush ready to go in that water. I also have another brush. This one I'm going to leave dry for a reason. I have a crayon. I'm going to use a white crayon because it might work the best for what I want to try and do today. If you don't have a white crayon, any crayon's going to work. I have a cotton ball. If you don't have a cotton ball, you can use tissues, toilet paper, Q-tips, anything that will soak up a liquid. Any kind of fabric or cloth, but today we're using a cotton ball. I have masking tape, or I'm sorry, I have painter's tape. If you don't have painter's tape, you can use masking tape. But for this, I have, oh, and I forgot, I have salt. Coarser the better. I have some good coarse kosher salt. We're going to use that for experiment. All right, so I have my watercolor paper taped down to my desk. Remember, in the last video, I talked about how paper, when water is added, will curl. It's going to warp. If you've ever gotten a book from the library wet, you notice the pages get a little crinkly. Same thing happens. So even though this is watercolor paper, it could still warp and curl up. So I taped my paper to the desk to avoid that. If you don't have a desk at home, you can tape this to a clipboard, or I use a piece of masonite. You can ask your parents what that is. It's just at Lowe's or Home Depot for like a dollar or two. You can tape this to the canvas. You can use a canvas if it's a watercolor canvas. But not only have I taped it with painter's tape to my desk, I've also taped different openings, so different spaces. I have 8 of those. You can do them a little crazy like I did and make different geometric shapes. You can just tape them, make some rectangles, but we're gonna do 8 watercolor techniques today. All right, I hope you're ready. All right, so remember I told you guys that I have my watercolor paper taped to my desk to avoid it from warping, and I taped off 8 different sections to broadcast 8 different techniques that we're going to use today in watercolor. So a few of these we're going to start and then come back to because we need the paint to dry. But I have my watercolor palette. This is my cheaper one that I got at Target, I think. But it has all the colors I like to use. So I'm going to get started here. I have my brush. I wet it in the water. These watercolors are all solids, so we need to get them wet for them to work. All right, so let's get started. We are first going to do a wet on wet technique. So I'm going to start with, actually, you know what? I don't want to start with that blue. That blue is kind of dark. So wet on wet is going to create kind of like a foggy, pretty cloud effect. I like to wet my watercolor paper first before I go in with some watercolors. So I'm going to start with this green. All right, so it's wet on wet. So I'm going to go on this watercolor paper with one color, and then right away, while it's wet, I'm going to hit it with another color. So here is my green. All right, I have some green. So my green is wet. I'm going to come back here, get some blue, and go right over this green. And you'll see how it kind of blends together naturally wherever that water goes. Pretty cool. I love this. I love the effect it makes. This is really nice for making oceans or the sky. All right. And you can go back over it. Let's say I want to go back over it with some more green. I don't like the way that looks. Looks a little too white or too light colored. I want to make sure everything's covered. And there we go. We got some wet on wet. Our next one that we're going to do is wet on dry. So we're going to start this one and we're going to have to come back to it. All right. So I'm going to go with yellow. So like I said, we're going to have to come back to this one because it's got to be wet on dry. So this yellow I'm putting down needs to be dry before we can see what happens. So I'm just going to make sure and give it a good wash. All right. I went with a lighter color on purpose just so you can see the effect later. All right, so we just had to start that one and come back to it once it dries because it won't be the same if the yellow is wet, because it won't just have the same effect that we have right here, which is wet on wet. We want wet on dry. All right, so we're going to come back to our wet on dry. I'm also going to prep another section here. This time, this is a pretty color. All right. This, we're going to do the same thing, and I'm calling it a wash because we're just taking one color. It's pretty much the same in value all the way across. So this technique that we're going to prep for is going to be a dry brush. I could have done this without painting the background, but I really want you guys to see how we can kind of take a couple different techniques and put them together. All right, and then another thing I didn't talk about is the brush. You know, some brushes are specifically made for watercolor. The best way to pick them out, they are the softest bristles. So the bristles are the hair on the top. The ones that are really soft, almost like your hair on your head, those are your watercolor brushes. Now you can use acrylic brushes for watercolor, but formally and traditionally we have watercolor brushes for this reason. All right, so I have my wet on wet. I prepped my wet on dry. I'm prepping my dry brush. All right, so we are going to go to something called a graded wash. So here and here we called washes. One color. The yellow, you can really see it. It's the same value, yellow all the way through. A graded wash, you might know as a something called ombre. So we're gonna ombre a section. I'm gonna use, I really like cool color, so I'm gonna stick with the cool colors. Let's do this blue again. All right, so if you know what ombre is, it's a dark color and it gradually turns lighter. Same thing here. So I want to make sure this side that I'm painting right now stays this dark or even darker, and I'm going to gradually lighten it. Now, we don't lighten it like we would do with acrylic or oil paints. We're not going to add white. We're just going to add water. I just want to add water and pull the color down, okay? You're going to have to go over it a couple of times just to get the effect that you absolutely want. It's your watercolor, it's your painting. I want to make sure that you can visually see the change. All right, so I want to make sure it's darker on this side and it gradually lightens as it goes down. All right, so remember, if you want it to be a lighter color, you're going to need to add water. If you want it to get a little bit darker, you're going to need to add more watercolor paint. That's that pigment that we talked about last video. The pigment's your color. So I'm going to come back this way. Make sure it's all blended together nicely. I kind of like that. It's got a few air bubbles in it because I was messing around with it, but that's okay. It's going to dry. They'll pop. So it's a graded wash. It starts dark and it gradually gets lighter. So we have 4 techniques so far. So for our 5th one, we are going to use salt. This is my favorite. So we're going to come in. I'm going to do a wash. I'm going to choose, let's do purple for JMU. I'm going to pick one color. Now for this, the salt technique, you guys can paint this however you want. I just happen to like how wet looks on wet. So I'm going to make sure I have a nice, I want to make sure this is super wet because what the salt's going to do is soak up the paint and it leaves a really cool effect. All right, I painted this one section. I'm going to take my kosher salt and I am going to sprinkle it all over this section. Ta-da. And we are going to let it dry. All right, so do not touch it. Not yet. We need to let it dry first. All right, wet on wet. We're going to come back to wet on dry. We're going to come back to dry brush. I'm going to move some of this salt out of the way. Graded wash. Salt. Make sure all that salt's out of the way in the other sections. Like, I'm a little messy sometimes. What we need to do next is a crayon resist. This is super popular, especially in elementary school. I'm going to take my crayon and I'm going to doodle design. I really like mermaids, so we're going to do some mermaid scales. I'm going to draw some squiggles. You can do whatever you want. Obviously it's a white crayon, you can't really see what it's doing, but once we put watercolor on top, you'll be able to see it. I'm going really fast just to get through it. So I went and took my crayon and I doodled a design. Now, ooh, wrong brush. Right away, I can take a color. Let's use this guy right here. And it is called a crayon resist because wherever that crayon is, it is going to resist the watercolor. I've talked about in other science experiment videos, water and oil don't mix, water and wax don't mix. It's a chemical makeup thing. So you'll see as you paint, the doodle that I drew in my crayon is going to resist the watercolor so you can see it pop right from underneath it. I'm going to throw in some different colors. I like the way this looks. So this is my crayon resist. I might have to help it out a little bit. Push the water away. All right. Crayon resist. Done. Our next one, we're going to use cotton balls. We're going to use cotton balls because we're going to do something called lifting. We're going to lift the paint. So I should probably try a different color. What do you think? Pink. Why not? All right, so same thing that we did with the salt. We're going to make sure the entire area is nice and wet with watercolor paint. I'm I'm gonna make sure it's nice and dark also. I want to use a lot of pigment in this one. All right, so I did a really quick wash. I'm gonna take my cotton ball. You can leave it as it is, but I'm gonna pull mine apart a little bit. And I'm gonna put it right on top here. Now it's called lifting because we're gonna lift the paint up off of the paper. Ta-da! And again, like the salt, we're gonna just leave it. Don't touch it, all right, until it's dry. Our last one is plastic wrap, similar to the lifting, but it doesn't actually soak up the water, but it does leave a different design to it. So let's try this dark red. This is pretty color. All right, so same thing. I'm gonna go through here. I wanna make sure there's a wash going on. All right, a lot of the time you use a wash for backgrounds and then build. Watercolors, you build on. You want to build on watercolors. You don't want to hit it with all the color at once. You're not going to get the color or the saturation that you want. So I'm just going to quickly go through this guy here. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to try and fix this wash. This is a little messy. But once I have a nice even wash here, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to take my plastic wrap and I'm going to make sure it's a little crinkly. I'm going to put my plastic wrap right on top. You can kind of squish it. There. And you're done. So we're going to come back here to our wet on dry. This feels pretty dry right now. You can I already see it. You might not be able to see it in the video. The paper is lifting. So even watercolor paint's going to warp. It just happens when you add water to paper. So wet on dry, I'm going to take my paintbrush that is nice and wet and clean of all color. I'm going to get a color on here. I'm going to go back to this red. This was pretty. All right, remember this is wet on dry, so it's going to have a different effect than your wet on wet. And we're just going to come in. Okay. Notice it's not blending with the yellow because it's wet on dry. The yellow is not wet. So this is really for when you do foregrounds. You already have a wash in your background and you want to leave it and let it dry. Then you come through and do your foreground, so your trees and your ground and things like that. So that's your wet on dry. What's next is dry brushing. Now, I need a dry brush, so I can't use the brush I've been using, but I am going to use this brush to wet one of my colors here. I like this blue a lot. So I want to make sure that this, the blue I'm using is a little bit wet, just a little bit, just enough for the color to come up on my dry brush. It's literally a brush that is dry. So I'm going to try and get some color on this brush, and I am just going to sweep it. Look at the texture it makes. This would be awesome for grass and hair, right? So this is going to be something that adds texture to your watercolor. Where you have a smoother texture, here we have a rougher texture with our dry brush. All right, so I'm going to leave these be and let them dry because the salt, cotton balls, and plastics will need to dry. But just to go over it one more time, today we did a wet on wet technique, a wet on dry technique, dry brushing, a graded wash, I called it ombre. We did salt, crayon resist, lifting with a cotton ball, and our plastic wrap. I will show you guys the outcome as soon as it all dries. So here it is. I was a little bit impatient and started brushing off the salt, thinking the purple was dry, and it was not dry, but you can still see the effect. So we have our plastic wrap, our crayon resist, and our cotton ball lift. Our salt, I still have some salt on there because it's a little bit wet, but you can kind of see what happened with the effect of it. Our graded wash looks awesome. My dry brush, and then our wet on wet and our wet on dry. So, wow, long video. But I hope you guys try out some of these watercolor techniques. You don't have to do all of them. You can do a few of them. Or you can just wait until our next video, because our next video we're going to make a project. We are going to make sunflowers, and we're going to use watercolor, and we're going to need Elmer's glue for that one. So I absolutely love being able to share these different techniques and arts and crafts with you, and I love sharing my science experiments with you. I hope you enjoy them as well. Love and miss you all, and I will see you as soon as I possibly can. Bye, guys.